The historical injustice and displacement of the Manobo Pulangion. So, the story of the Manobo Pulangion people is marked by centuries of injustice, land disposition, and cultural erasure. Once stewards of rich ancestral lands in Mindanao, their lives were disrupted by foreign colonization and the rise of land-hungry elites. Starting during the American colonial period, 1898 to 1946, their territories were taken over for logging, ranching, and plantation using stripping them of not only land but also the right to self-determination. So this forced displacement, often backed by armed violence and legal manipulations, reflects a deeper pattern of marginalization faced by indigenous communities across the Philippines. Understanding this painful history is essential to addressing the long understanding injustice they continue to endure today. The displacement of the Manobo Pulangion began during the American colonial period. So, this the displacement of the Manobo Pulangion people began during the American colonial period in the Philippines. So, this marked the started of a long and painful process there, where their ancestral lands were taken from them. So, lands were taken by Spanish states settlers and Americans for logging, ranching, and plantation. So, lands were taken by Spanish mestizos, settlers, and Americans, so wealthy settlers, both local, with Spanish ancestry, and foreign, so especially Americans, so claimed indigenous land to use for business purposes. So they turned forest and farmlands into areas for logging, or like cutting down trees, not like then thus ranching, so raising cattle and then thus and plantations like large scale crop farming, and then completely ignoring the rights of the indigenous communities living there. So next, ancestral lands were transformed into private property like the Montalvan Ranch. Ancestral lands became private property. So, like traditional land that once belonged to the Manobo Pulangion. So, as a communal or family land was suddenly turned into private land owned by individuals or companies. So, a clear example in the is the Montalvan Ranch as a large property developed on what was once indigenous land. So this change meant the Manobo Pulangian were no longer recognized as rightful owners or stewards of the land. So next, cowboys and armed guards enforced these dispositions, often using violence. So these cowboys and armed guards enforced the takeover. So to take the indigenous people away, ranch owners and settlers hired cowboys and guards. So this mean um, often use force and violence to threaten and intimidate or and remove indigenous families. So the use of armed personnel created a climate of fear and danger, making it very hard for the Manobo Pulangian so to resist or return to their lands. So next, indigenous communities were denied access to their own lands and resources while elites gained political and economic control. So indigenous communities lost access to their resources. The Manubo Pulangian were cut off from their forest, rivers, and farmland places they depended on for food, medicine, and survival. Number 1. The first removal or pushing out of the Manobo Pulangion people from their ancestral lands started when the United States colonized the Philippines during 1898 to 1946. During this time, many indigenous groups were stripped of the rights to land that they had lived on for generations. The first removal of the Manobo Pulangion people from their ancestral lands began during the American colonization of the Philippines during 1898 to 1946. So, like many others indigenous groups, they were stripped of their land rights even though they had lived there for generations. Number two, lands were taken by Spanish mestizo, settlers, and Americans for logging, ranching, and plantations. So people with Spanish ancestry, Spanish mestizo, and American settlers seized indigenous lands to use them for commercial activities such as cutting down trees, raising cattle, and growing crops on a large scale. These outsiders claimed the land for profit, ignoring the original indigenous inhabitants. So over time, Spanish mestizo and American settlers took over this land. So they tuned the areas into places for logging, ranching, and large plantations, using the land to make money without considering the people who originally live there. So yeah. So number three, ancestral lands were transformed into private property like the Montalvan Ranch. So land that traditionally belonged to the Manobo Pulangion as part of their ancestral domain was turned into private property owned by individuals or companies like the well-known Montalvan Ranch. This meant the land was no longer recognized as a colonial or indigenous land, but instead became part of the formal landownership systems that excluded indigenous claims. So, one example of this is the Montalval Ranch, which was once part of the Manobo Pulangion ancestral land. So, these lands which used to be shared by the community, so was turned into private property owned by powerful individuals or businesses. Because of this, the Manobo Pulangion lost their legal rights to the land. Number four, cowboys and armed guards enforce this disposition, often using violence. So, to keep indigenous people of these lands, armed personnel such as cowboys and guards were hired. They use force and violence to intimidate, evict, or prevent the Manubupulangian from returning to or using their own central land. So, this made it in dangerous for indigenous families to resist or reclaim their territory. So, to keep the indigenous people from returning, armed guards and cowboys were hired. So, they used violence and intimidations to stop the Manobo Polangian from reclaiming their land. This created fear and made it nearly impossible for the community to fight back. Number five, indigenous communities were denied access to their own lands and resources while elites gained political and economic control. So, the Manobo Pulangian and other indigenous groups were not allowed to use or enter their ancestral land, including forests, rivers, and fields that they depended on for survival. So at the same time, wealthy and powerful individuals took over these lands, gaining control over both an economy and politics in the area. This created a system where indigenous people were left marginalized while the elites became even more powerful. So as a result, the Manobo Polangian were denied access to their forests, rivers, and field resources they needed to survive. Meanwhile, elites gained more political and economic power, leading to a leading to a situation where indigenous people become even more marginalized and powerless in their own homeland.